Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on when you're watching. This is our fourth episode of Unfiltered IT. Today, the topic of discussion is right cloud, wrong workload. We're going to be talking about uh, items in the cloud, how to migrate those workloads to the cloud, talking about patriation and repatriation of cloud. But we're going to start at its lowest level and kind of go through what is cloud and look at and evaluate some of the options that are out there as far as cloud is concerned. I have a really good expert with me today for this episode. So we'll just kind of get right into it here. I have Moosa with me from 1111 Systems. Moosa, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself and kind of talk about your background and your history as it goes with the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, thank you for having me on. It's really an honor, and I've been waiting for the invite, man, for years. But Moosa Matariyeh, I'm with 1111 Systems. 1111 Systems is a organization comprised of a number of acquisitions, and we've kind of brought those technologies together to be able to provide a very cohesive experience across cloud connectivity and security. I've been in the industry for nearly 30 years now, which is crazy to say. Started out as an engineer and spent the first 15, 17 years of my career as an engineer working on data center architecture, everything across RS 6000, now System P, through your Windows x86 platforms, virtualization, server storage, and most recently working in the as a service space, helping clients really find an operationalized model to solve their problems.
Yeah. Hey, and one of the things I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I've been starting to ask some of the guests this when I only have a single guest on, but as VP of Global Channel and Solutions, I'm sure you've architected and seen a lot of different things. Tell me about like one of the coolest cloud projects you think you've done with 1111 so far,
Um, I
or
think
most
one
impactful, maybe.
I think one of the most impactful. So we focus heavily on the disaster recoverability, and more and more organizations, especially in the financial and retail and healthcare sectors, are heavily focused on their ability to recover just because of the bad actors in our space. We have one client that's a publicly traded organization, and they actually state twice a year in their quarterly report that they've performed successful tests. Well, they're in retail. If you know anything about retail, October 1 to about January 15th, the world is in lockdown. You can't unplug. You can't make any changes to an environment. As soon as January 15th comes around, they start doing all of their updates, applications, everything. Uh, Going into their second test of the year, they had some failures. And it was because of the middleware and the application updates that they had done, a lot of custom applications, and our ability to go in there and be able to get them a successful test. We were able to dedicate a few dozen engineers to work through it and just be able to get them a successful test prior to their earnings announcement so they could instill some confidence in their shareholders. And the impact of that one, yes, it's a test. They weren't in a disaster scenario, but the impact to the organization that drastically would have impacted their share price being a retail organization.
Wow. Hey, yeah, that's awesome. So I guess let's kind of get into some facts around the cloud. I know most people are utilizing the cloud in some capacity. We hear of things like SaaS, platform as a service, PaaS, but just some global facts here. 90% of organizations now use one or more cloud services. I think, Musa, we've seen this switch in the industry. Kind of gone are the days of legacy infrastructure on site for being the first choice, at least when evaluating what to do with the product. I think, you've seen it where we're either evaluating running our own Exchange server in the cloud, or we're evaluating Office 365. It's either a software as a service or a cloud solution, but gone are the days of starting with, well, we'll put that resource on site. Um, and I think this one is staggering. Half of enterprise workloads now run in some sort of public cloud environment, whether that's, the big hyperscalers or somebody like yourself at 1111 Systems or an Expedient or any of those other vendors that exist out there. Um, And here's another one that was crazy that I had found was that 60% of business data now resides in some sort of cloud platform, or reflecting in some sort of cloud platform. And you guys see this. Why don't you talk a little bit, Moosa, about some of the stuff that you see with not just your storage platform, but this number, how it relates to maybe your object storage that you guys offer, and maybe kind of elaborate, because I think you guys see this 60% of data residing in some sort of cloud. You see that the most because of who you guys are and what you guys do.
Yeah, I think just industry wide, you've seen the proliferation of SaaS applications and just how impactful they can be to organizations in simplification, not just from an IT perspective, but an end user perspective. Think about expense platforms. Historically, had an SAP or some sort of very monolithic complex application to manage your expenses, and your users had to go scan their documents and then email them to themselves, and like it just wasn't a great end user experience. And now that you have these applications that are so focused on a single task, in the simplicity of deployment, you have things like Expensify and other applications for your expenses that have made it so much easier, where you get a receipt, you take a quick picture of it, it uploads in there, it fills out all the information, and you submit your report. So I think that's one big thing. The other thing that has taken a huge foothold is we've all become data hoarders. We don't know when we're going to need it. And it was always present at some level on a user sense, where we just never deleted emails and our emails were meeting limits and all of this. Well, Microsoft kind of took care of that problem with 365 by increasing your limits per mailbox, if you have one, a limit at all, depending on your administrator. But then on top of that, you have all the AI, right? What was 7 years ago, BI data. You had these data lakes, and now that's all turned into AI, because that makes you sound more advanced and modernized, and that's the current hot term. I won't get into it, but we're hoarding data. So
Yeah.
to keep that on-prem, to keep that within your own environment on your storage platforms, that means you have to continually expand your storage platforms, your infrastructure. You have to back it up and protect it, and there's just a lot associated with that. So we're seeing more and more archival moving to cloud platforms, object storage, just storage blobs, whatever platform it may be, and putting it in either cold or accessible storage. It's not necessarily always online. It depends on your usage, and if you've actually gone through and classified the data. And it becomes much more cost effective because you're not accessing that data regularly. You no longer have to continually back it up if you've set it up properly to either replicate across a couple cloud platforms or set some level of protection on it. It simplifies the management of your production infrastructure. It removes a lot of tasks from having to manage that data without having to age it out. Because if you're going to run BI, if you're going to run AI across it, use it for a learning model, you now have that proprietary data. So we're seeing just the amount of data explode, not just because of the creation, but the preservation of historical data.
Definitely. And, I think this statistic about 80% of enterprises report using some sort of leading enterprise cloud provider for at least some of their workloads. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later here with how we're going to evaluate, or how a customer should go about evaluating what workloads need to go where. But I think this is another good one that you can touch on, Musa, is, this is this next kind of fact here: cost control, security, skill gaps all remain some of the most cited cloud hurdles, particularly across multi-cloud estates where people are managing across maybe, a public cloud provider like yourself and a hyperscaler like Microsoft Azure. Um, why don't you talk a little bit about what somebody like an organization like 1111 can bring to a customer with some of those cost control, security, and skill gap items as it relates to getting them in a cloud presence?
Yeah. So I think where organizations like 1111 come in is when there's a realization from the client side that their team is overstretched. And when you look at the mid-market and small business, you you don't have a dedicated cloud person that has 10 years of experience managing those infrastructures, that has seen the ins and outs and learned the shortcuts and had the hands-on experience to develop the knowledge set to go in there and create maximum efficiency. Quite often what they have is the framework of it, right? They understand the ins and outs. They understand the standard architectural, the standard security, the standard management needs of it. But what they don't have is the time, or sometimes the experience. Quite often it's the experience as well, to continually go in there, optimize the environment. Cloud is a living, breathing thing. And to get the most out of it, you don't just throw something out there and leave it static. It needs to be dynamic. If your workload is dynamic, the infrastructure, the architecture, the security, just so many different things need to be continually managed and cared for. It sounds overwhelming. It's not that it's overwhelming. It's that coupled with everything else these individuals in these mid-market organizations are being tasked to do, they have to prioritize. And do I need to resize or allocate more memory to this application, or reduce the amount of memory for some cost savings, and then I can balloon it back up as necessary? Or do I need to go do these critical updates? Do I need to do what the business is asking for right now? There's a trade-off. There's a finite amount of time that they have. So I think that the cost control security is a direct result of either the lack of skills or the lack of time. And quite often it's the latter, the lack of time. So that's where organizations like 1111 come in and really assist with that. And it can be quarterly checks, it can be ongoing management. It's really what's right for the customer.
And I think we've seen this all be cyclical. I think the first thing that was the big cloud to do was with the Exchange platform and moving that to an Office 365 solution. And overnight everybody was like, well, we won't need system administrators anymore. Once this goes to the cloud, customers were tricked into thinking, oh, there's nothing to manage because it's in the cloud. And you and I both know that there's still, as you stated, even on the platform or the services side of things, there's still a lot of optimization left there for a technology company that you partner with to go in there and say, hey, are you allocating these licenses correctly? Are you making sure that resources are allocated correctly? Are you watching, your object storage utilization? And I know, with some of these facts, we kind of got into the weeds a little bit here, but if we could, let's take a step back. Let's just kind of talk about, for reference, what cloud is at a high level. People throw around a lot of different industry terms for cloud, and we're going to get into what some of those mean. But as far as cloud really refers to servers that are accessed through the internet, it's software, databases, any sort of service running in the cloud that is not locally owned necessarily by yourself. However, there are still cloud solutions where you can own that hardware. That hardware can be yours sitting in a rack. I would call that a data center solution. And really, I think the thing that made this take off, though, is the switch to say, we don't own the back end infrastructure. We're not responsible for managing what that physical layer looks like to keep our applications up and running. And that's what somebody like, 1111 Systems does. You're providing the virtual space for customers to come in there, bring their data and their servers and their platforms. But you guys are ultimately the ones responsible for optimizing the storage on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis, and potentially managing the backup and data replication and recovery of those vendors as well, or of that solution as well. But as we kind of get into what some of these clouds are, so we've thrown around a couple of terms that I want to make everybody familiar with. So hyperscaler, this is generally referred to as your big core 3, core 4. I say core 4 because there's one that kind of everybody misses, but this is your AWS, your Azure, your Google Cloud Computer, GCP, and then the other one that potentially, if you're outside of the United States, is a big presence, is Alibaba Cloud, is also a pretty big one. And then next would be your public cloud providers. And I think, Moosa, if you want to speak on public cloud providers and kind of their a little bit more flexibility. That's the space that 1111 sits in. So maybe kind of speak on what separates you guys, or what separates public cloud providers from those hyperscalers and things like that.
Yeah, I think the difference is pretty drastic. And depending what your use case is, one might be better than the other at an application layer. And I think that's what's really important for everybody to consider is what is the right estate for that particular workload? What is the usage of your users look like? Who are you trying to service? Who's going to be accessing it? Where are they located? What are they going to be using it for? So a great example. So if you look at the hyperscalers, I think AWS is over almost 500 different services that they offer on their platform. You look at Azure, they're also right around 400 or so different services. You look at the public cloud providers like 1111 and others in the space, none of us are anywhere near that, right? We're not trying to be everything to everybody. We don't have the capability to be everything for everybody. What we are is a platform where you have a more customized, a more boutique type of experience, whether you're a large enterprise or a mid-market or a small business. And with that experience that's being provided by these cloud providers, one of the big things is mitigating risk and simplifying that transition. So when you take a look at 1111, for example, we're hosted on VMware, which depending on where you stand today might be something that is of interest, or that might be very much a turnoff because of the things going on with VMware over the past couple of years. But if you're a VMware environment on-prem and you're looking to go to cloud, converting all your applications to run in a hyperscaler, there's risk associated with that. It's done by hundreds and thousands of organizations. It's not an impossible task. But if you're a very risk-averse organization, being able to go to a public cloud provider that's based on VMware simplifies that migration, gets you there quicker. It gives you a better support level because they are organizations focused on a smaller subset of customers with a very specific skill set. They're not trying to support, 400 plus different feature sets and functions. So I would say the public cloud providers are giving you a more localized experience. They're focused on reducing the risk of that migration and keeping your performance equal to or better. You can modernize applications. And quite often what you'll see as organizations are moving to a public cloud provider, they're also leveraging some of those more advanced services like DevOps, things of that nature within the hyperscalers. So the public cloud providers have taken the step to make sure that they're localized to on-ramps to be able to provide a seamless experience across those two environments. And an on-ramp is going to give you much better network performance into those hyperscalers. So now you can do things like put that archive data in a hyperscaler, but still have very high speed connectivity from your main applications that are sitting on a public cloud provider. So there's a lot of areas that it fits into, but I would say the biggest thing is take a look at where your applications really belong rather than picking between one or another. And you're going to be a multi-cloud environment if you look at it thoughtfully. And another big one that is further down the list is SaaS. Right? If you look at application by application, you're going to end up across a few, at least three of these, I would say, typically, three of these different cloud definitions here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, to get into that, that's why kind of the next subset is, private cloud, shared cloud, dedicated hosted cloud. These have been names that have kind of popped out of, many of these providers do multiple of those things. And so, private cloud being more of what classically we would have thought of as somebody putting their own private infrastructure in another data center or renting rack space in a larger data center facility. And, certain companies, that's still a good process. But I think what we've seen is the stretch on that skill gap again is having the people that can build out that highly redundant environment. I mean, you're really most of the providers now are taking that heavy lift off of the in-house IT team and putting it on the provider to configure that. And most of these public cloud providers are going to fall under that shared cloud where the resources are shared amongst hundreds, if not thousands, of different customers across the platform because you guys manage that in the background. With the exception of, I have seen like dedicated host providers, which is that next statement where, you've got either exclusive reservations or resources, or you're running exclusively on hardware that's still being managed by the provider, and that's dedicated for you. You've talked about software as a service, and I think everybody's most familiar with that. That's going to be your Office 365, your QuickBooks Online, your Oracle NetSuite, your SAP Cloud. Um, but then as well, two of the other things that people don't necessarily mention is desktop as a service. So offering user desktops uh, in the cloud, that's pretty common among larger organizations, people with distributed staff, a lot of call center companies. But as well, then infrastructure as a service, not necessarily cloud related, but I do kind of lump that underneath here because there are providers that can, if you still want to be on dedicated hardware, manage that hardware almost like it is a cloud solution, but still sitting on premise. And I think this is where, we evaluate what workloads need to go to a software as a service platform, what workloads need to go to public hyperscalers, what workloads need to go to public cloud. Are there workloads where we need dedicated hosting? Are there workloads where we have to be able to put our AS400 in a data center somewhere and still give it access? So that kind of sums up the different sort of cloud buzzwords that you might think of when it comes to cloud. And this slide here just gives some examples. I know we've talked about different vendor names already, so I think rather than take up a ton of time here, but I just want people to be able to familiarize themselves with what some of these things mean and how they interplay with the providers that are available in the space that can perform those items. But kind of what we normally do here, Moosa, is go through some questions. So I put together some questions out of things that I've heard at industry events and also questions that have come up from customers. And this is really where we kind of get into at a high level what things can look like. So if you don't mind, let me ask you a couple of questions with your industry experience about kind of some of the pitfalls and things that you've seen with customers evaluating the cloud. So, biggest one, do most cloud providers offer more than one style of cloud service? We just showed those examples and talked about the different offerings. I think, you guys specifically, but the industry, why don't you kind of talk about what that looks like?
Yeah, I think looking back at your last slide, actually 2 slides ago, if we're talking about the provider space outside of the hyperscaler, so if we're looking at the 1111, the Expedients, the Rapid Scales, to your point, we all do offer more than one service, and the reason for that is you want to give that reduced risk environment. You want to give that end user experience, but the big driver behind the other thing is really performance as well as security. So if you look at a financial firm, for example, there is a level of security that is greater than your typical manufacturing firm. And to be able to address across verticals, across industries, it's necessary to be able to provide that multi-tenant environment, that dedicated environment, and help a customer identify which one's right for them based on their security posture. They may also have some noisy applications or applications where it makes more sense to put it on a dedicated server, even though the backend storage may be a multi-tenant environment. So it's really about addressing the customer's needs. The client, the organization shouldn't be forced into one model because of a single application's needs. And the security piece has been something that is always on top of it, on everybody's mind. It's become more accepted that multi-tenant is secure, but you still have to be careful with it. And you have to meet some of the regulatory obligations that they have, as well as their internal security policies. So, yeah, just about every public cloud provider has multiple different services.
And then you kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe if you want to go deeper right there at the end of that, what do you think there are, being an organization that offers multiple solutions in the path, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of using a vendor or using a provider, I guess, take a step back, using a single cloud provider like a hyperscaler? I think you kind of touched on that already, but what do you see are the advantages and disadvantages of using a single cloud provider? So really the hyperscalers is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's applicable to both sides, right? From a hyperscaler perspective, the big advantage is being able to manage everything through a single portal. That's important to some. Being able to see your entire estate, your billing methodologies, everything else. You're also going to have access to so many more services. The question is, do you need them? Do you really need more than a few standardized services for your infrastructure? Maybe you do have a DevOps team. There's no reason that you can't separate those, the DevOps environment from your production infrastructure. And you're also forced into t-shirt sizes on a hyperscaler. So you may have to over allocate infrastructure to it, which you're going to be paying for on a regular basis. Another big disadvantage, and this is really a comparison between the hyperscalers and the public cloud providers, is egress fees. So if you've heard the nightmares, anybody out there that's heard the nightmares as to, well, cloud isn't cheaper. Cloud, we got our cloud bill and, it looks like a 90s cell phone bill. Well, part of that is driven by your egress fees. So every time you access data from outside that immediate tenancy within the hyperscaler, you pay for transmission costs for that data. So it can get out of control really, really quickly. And that's why we talk about the right workload for the right platform. If it's something you're constantly hitting, you're moving a lot of data out. You're reading a lot of data. There's a lot of API calls on an application. That may end up being much more expensive than a hyperscaler. On the public cloud providers, there's typically no egress fees. You're typically given a pool of resources rather than t-shirt sizes that you can then assign accordingly within your environment. So you don't necessarily have to over allocate. You can add more memory to a virtual machine rather than moving machine types on a public cloud provider. But on the public cloud provider, what are you going to do with that DevOps environment? What are you going to do with some of the more advanced features that you may be looking for that are only available on a hyperscaler? So I truly believe moving to a single cloud provider is the wrong decision. It's very rarely the right thing to do, simply because you have so many different applications, the needs of those applications, the needs of the users of those applications, the locality. There's a lot of variables in there. You just need to take a very thoughtful approach.
And I think that piggybacks off of the next question, which is, and I think I know what you're going to say about this already, but what are the advantages and disadvantages to using a multi-cloud approach? I think you've already kind of touched on that. We've talked about a lot of the advantages of taking and managing that multi-cloud approach, but I think the thing that's interesting that you did mention is single pane of glass for management. That is one of the biggest things that I have seen is as we go through the process and you take a multi-cloud approach, you do have management jump around. You've got to go to this interface to manage this platform, this interface to manage that platform. Like you said, organizations probably have 2 or 3 SaaS apps on top of that. So now we've got 2 or 3 other interfaces for managing. And I think the bigger thing that I see with that is in the more highly regulated industries, now I have to manage my DLP policies across all these platforms. I have to manage my backup and recovery, my business continuity disaster recovery plan across these 3 to 5 platforms. So I really do think, there's a right fit for both. I think what we're seeing is just some of the advantages and disadvantages that we've seen all the time about even, we talked about this in the security space a few years ago, which is go with a company that has their own security stack and can just give it to you versus building your own security stack in-house. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. And they all filter around kind of management and capability and whether you want to buy best of breed or have a fully canned solution. But I think it's the same conversation with these things. Um, I'm going to hit you with something here. We talked about this. It's not an all or nothing proposition. So just because you're running Windows, I hear things like, oh, well, we're running Windows. We have to go to Azure because it's Microsoft. Or, oh, we have a DevOps team and they use Docker. That means we got to go to AWS for those Docker containers because that's the easiest place to put it. We talked about this. It's put the right workflows with the right vendors. The management you can figure out after the fact, but really this is kind of the pitfalls that I see about customers saying that cloud is so expensive is because they really haven't put the right workloads with the right providers. And so, like you said, you're getting those t-shirt sizes, whether that's on workloads, whether that's on storage, whether that's on compute. And what ends up happening is you end up paying more for things that you really didn't need or paying more to be a square peg in a round hole type of situation. Um, and I think even I'm sure you're seeing this, Moosa, in the industry as well. There are still companies that are taking that hybrid approach where they do have some level of resources that still remain on site, and they bundle that with a handful of SaaS applications as well. I think that's still a common practice that we're seeing, and I don't know that that's really going to go away either.
It shouldn't.
Yeah.
It shouldn't. And on-site doesn't necessarily mean in your data center or your data closet. It might be in a colo facility on your hardware. It might be a public cloud provider. It might be a private infrastructure from a cloud provider. I think the terminology of some of them being on-site or outside the hyperscaler, that the definition of that and what that really looks like and what it is continues to evolve and
Yeah.
change.
I think the other thing is on-site doesn't necessarily have to mean the company that owns the on-site equipment has to hold the risk and the depreciating asset and all of those things related to physical hardware, the costly replacement cycles we talked about, infrastructure as a service. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to now foot the responsibility for that still. There's plenty of these private cloud providers that will also rent hardware that goes on site to run in a hybrid model or manage that hardware that's on site in the same way they manage their hardware in their data center. So with that, what approach should customers take to evaluating and assessing the workloads that they have to move to any of these cloud environments? I know, we classically have seen kind of the lift and shift the way we saw people move from physical hardware to a virtualized environment. Oh, I had all these resources in physical boxes. I need my virtual host to have that same amount of resources. I know you and I constantly see over allocation of resources happening in the cloud. And the dirty secret with that is, like, quite frankly, you're hurting your performance. You're not making the experience better on your infrastructure if you're doing those types of things. So really, talk maybe a little bit about how you guys go about evaluating what needs to go to the cloud, and maybe talk a little bit. I know there's a handful of tools out there. People may have heard of like RV tools. You guys use a product called Catalyst. There's Live Optics to really understand at a level what the usage is in your environment and how that needs to scale into the cloud.
Yeah, there's so many tools out there, and the tools are giving you theory. Unfortunately, we operate in the real world. So the first thing that the first thought I would recommend to anybody considering modernizing or evolving their environment and leveraging some cloud where they haven't historically done so. Just because it could doesn't mean it should. That's the first thing I think you really have to wrap your mind around. Just because Live Optics or Catalyst or any other application says it could move to XYZ platform doesn't mean it should. I would say the first conversation you should have internally is as an IT leader with your CFO. And that's a step that is so often missed in our industry. Because you need to truly understand what it means to the organization from a financial and a reporting and an accounting perspective, moving from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. That's going to be impactful depending on your ownership, how you report, Are you PE backed? Are you publicly traded? Like all of these things factor into it. We see so many projects where all the steps have been taken, that conversation hasn't been had. The project goes to approval, the CFO looks at it and they're like, no, we want to do a single outlay. We don't want to do a monthly cost. We don't want to operationalize that cost because it's much more beneficial to us to do a single outlay. So you really need to go have that conversation. Then from there, I would begin at the application and user level. Where are your users that are accessing the applications? And what is the application profile? One of the biggest things, so everybody's hearing about this huge repatriation of applications. It's not because cloud is failing. And typically you're hearing about repatriation from the hyperscalers. It's not that there's a problem with the cloud. It's that the wrong applications were moved there and it caused dramatic cost increases. A lot of those steps were taken out of desperation in 2020, 2021, in times where there was shortage on CPUs. They couldn't do a hardware refresh. They had to spin up a new application. So a lot of applications were moved out of necessity, and organizations are now getting around being able to take that thoughtful approach, take a look at it and be like, well, we're paying X amount of dollars every month for this application. If we take a look at that, that's like 18 months of a server cost, fully loaded server cost with the rack space, the power, everything. Why would we do it? Exactly. Why would you do it? Right? You did it out of desperation. Why do you keep doing it? Just because that's the way you've done it for the past couple of years doesn't mean you should keep doing it that way. So first, understand that just because it could doesn't mean it should. Second, talk to your CFO. Understand the financial impact to what makes better sense for the organization. Then next, take a look at the applications and the users. What's the application profile? Is it static? Is it very dynamic? Is it something that's bursty? Are you a seasonal business? And this application also performance increases on a seasonality basis. That helps you start getting an idea. And then the empirical data, right? What Live Optics and everybody else gives you, that's really, I would say, just helps support some of the decisions you're making. It's not going to drive it. That shouldn't be the driver.
Yeah, no, it definitely shouldn't. We talked about how to size those workloads and things like that. And I know we've all talked and seen a lot of failed deployments to the cloud or kind of half-baked deployments to the cloud. So, what do you think are some common contributors? You've talked, about starting at the CFO level in the last question I asked. What do you think are some common contributors to failed cloud deployments, and how can customers prevent those?
Besides the thought process, like really thoughtfully thinking about the application profile and is it bursty, is it not? One of the biggest issues is not properly setting the foundation. Before you move your first workload, before you do anything, you have to think about your identity and access management. What are the security foundations that you have to put into place? Because of the rush and the necessity to move certain applications to cloud over the past handful of years, that foundation was built to support a small environment. It was built for not the entire enterprise. And then what happened, of course, was proliferation. You started with a few applications in cloud, and what the security posture that you built within there was built for those few applications. And now suddenly you've got 50, 75, 100 servers running in there. And the applications that you have since moved into there have a different security profile, higher level security. Maybe they're holding financial documents, PII data, whatever it may be. And you haven't updated your security posture. You haven't made changes there. So we see that security piece being one big thing. So I would say that as you're changing this goes back to the comment that it's a living, breathing thing. As you change how you're using cloud, you must look at your underlying services. You can't just spin up new environments. You can, but it's not the right thing to do. You're not stopped from it. And that's the big thing. You're not protected from yourself. Another thing is old applications moving in there and unsupportability, conflicts, We also see where you're moving a subset of your environment and there's part of that application stack is expected to be kept on-prem because you haven't gone through the thoughtful process of identifying a full application stack. And suddenly, little things like, you've got a client portal and the client portal works, but your client's logo is no longer appearing on that client portal. I actually experienced that with a migration that we did because it was missed that there was a file server that held the images of the client logos for the client portals, and that those images were kept on a file server that remained on-prem while the client portal was taken to hyperscaler. So it's just the thoughtfulness. It's these small little things that you only learn through experience.
No, totally. I think, you talked about the thoughtfulness. I think one of the things that I've seen a big problem with is not necessarily, I would say it's not the pitfalls of a failed deployment. I mean, I would group it under a failed deployment, but it doesn't rear its head initially. We talk about some of these customers where they see the cost either slowly creep up over time, or they get to one of these providers, whether it's a hyperscaler or a public cloud provider, and the cost is way more than they expect it. We see it all the time. People take those like for like resources. So that kind of gets into my next slide here, which is, what works on site doesn't necessarily work in the cloud. So we just did a copy and paste really of our resources on site. Oh, this box had X number of CPUs and 84 gigs of RAM. But oh, by the way, it was a completely unoptimized database that we were running on premise, and we're not, and like you said, we don't fix the underlying problem. We don't optimize the database before we take that workload to the cloud. And then we expect, because the cloud has infinitely scalable resources, oh, we'll just throw more resources at the problem. This will fix the problem. And then 2 years down the road, now we end up with this incredibly high bill that wasn't what we initially got quoted because of the way that we've handled the outcome of the problem, not the underlying issue. And so we just took workloads that potentially were unoptimized or were not configured correctly from the start and moved those same workloads into the cloud. I think, that's one of the benefits, however, to cloud is, you guys have a very deep bench. Most of these public cloud providers, unlike the hyperscalers, they have a public facing deep bench. So when you do run into optimization issues with kind of standard applications, things like database services, file services, you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a whole pro services bench that can come in and help assist customers with re-optimizing these things to move them to the cloud, or optimizing once they move to the cloud.
Yeah, that's a religion of sorts. Do we hold the garage sale before we move into the new house, or do we want to pack everything up, move into the new house, and then we're going to hold the garage sale? And we all know what happens in that scenario. Those boxes sit unpacked in the garage in the new house for months, if not years. You have to face the facts. You're gonna be spending more, and you're gonna continue to kick the can down the road if the expectation is to optimize after movement. One of the uses of public cloud that we've seen, the public cloud providers, is I want to stair step into modernizing my environment. So my equipment is fully depreciated. It's up for refresh. Maybe my Broadcom VMware contract is up for renewal. Whatever it may be, we have a catalyst, an event that is driving us to do something. They're moving to a public cloud platform, a VMware hosted public cloud platform, for the simplicity of the move. They can get there inside of 60, maybe 90 days if they've got a huge environment. They're up and running in there. And now they can take that thoughtful approach to do things like, should this be a SaaS application? Yes, great. Let's start the migration. Now that event, that ticking clock is no longer running for them. But they've taken a step, and they can do it at their own speed because they still have to service the business. Our recommendation is to absolutely use some professional services for that to help expedite it, because then it's done on a more reasonable time frame, as well as what's being built when When you've picked the right partner, you know what's being built is properly, that foundation is laid properly. They understand your vision. They're building for your vision rather than in a very fixed model. And they can help you get there quicker. Yes, we do have a full professional services bench that can come in and optimize your existing environment in public cloud, help you identify applications that would be better serviced than I'm sorry, they can modernize or optimize your hyperscaler environment, help you identify some applications that maybe should go to SaaS, maybe could be better serviced in a public cloud. Most organizations have that. But it's really important to minimize how much you're kicking that can down the street.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, admittedly, we talked about some of this being a skill gap. I think, a lot of that kicking the can is one of two reasons. It either is the skill gap or the bandwidth, the time gap with, customers that have their own internal IT. I think it's probably a combination of both. I agree with you. I think it more leans to the slant of time gap versus skill gap. But I think that is the neat thing about utilizing somebody in a private cloud space or a public cloud space is that they have those additional resources. They're doing these migrations all the time, so they really can help with the optimization conversation. And so, while we're on the topic of optimization, I think this is one of the pitfalls that we've seen about repatriation on the cloud. So you're now hearing cloud's been around long enough. We're hearing, oh, we picked up and moved from this platform to that platform. We went from AWS to Azure, or we went from, an Azure resource to an 1111 or an Expedient. So why do you think, with the exception of dollars, because, that is something that's really driving these conversations, why do you think we're seeing so much of this repatriation now, 3 to 5 years after cloud's kind of become a thing? Is it just contract end dates, or is it more than that? Is it more? Do you think it's more around people kind of understanding, okay, this is what our first toe step looked like? As you stated, we did this in a rush because of potentially the COVID era. And what do you think? What do you think are the reasons that sometimes these guys are even looking to move back on site with some of these resources?
I think the biggest thing is wisdom and humility. And those organizations that are now taking a look at their environments and determining what the right platform is, I really applaud them. It takes a lot of humility to say, hey, we did this because we had to 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. But now when we look at it, there's a better way for us to do it moving forward. So I think that's a big part of it. Some of those analyses or thoughts are triggered because of cost. Quite often that's the case. Other times it's because usage is different, right? You had people that went 100% remote for a number of years. Organizations are starting to pull people back into offices. So sometimes you're seeing some organizations saying, well, most of our users are moving back in-house. We don't need this DaaS platform. We don't need this. Our users are coming in, or we're expanding into different areas of the world. So we're going to change to somebody that's more localized from a hyperscaler. We're seeing movement from the public cloud providers to the hyperscalers for that globalization. So I think that there's a lot of movement across all the platforms. It's not necessarily from the hyperscalers out. It's all spread pretty evenly. But the biggest driver behind it is really wisdom and humility, I would say. There's been a lot of lessons learned, profiles of users, applications, their business model has changed, and they're taking all of that into consideration. They finally have a moment to take a breath and think about it. So I just think that that's been a big part of it.
Gotcha. Well, we often hear one of the drivers that was the push for cloud is better business continuity, better disaster recovery, better failover and capability. And I know, us as engineers, we sometimes look at that and go, well, just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean you got all of that with that. So with that said, when it comes to a cloud-based strategy and when it comes to looking at hyperscalers or public cloud providers, what do you think the biggest miss from customers or businesses are when it comes to the backups and DR of that environment? Because I see it a lot. when we went to the cloud, we stopped practicing a 3-2-1 backup thought process or mentality. We decided, hey, this is in the cloud. We don't need to control the data backups on it anymore. I think unfortunately some customers have seen the fallout from this, where it's, oh, I didn't realize that vendor, that hyperscaler wasn't responsible, or that private cloud provider wasn't responsible for my backup.
Um, I want to kind of be, if I could, Chris, I want to address this from a few different perspectives based on the
Yeah.
platform.
Yeah, go for it.
Unfortunately, this year we've had, I think, 3 major outages of hyperscalers. We've had numerous global applications that have gone down. And if that doesn't open people's eyes to the reality that nothing is bulletproof, I'm not quite sure what will. One of the biggest misconceptions, I would say, is that when you're in a hyperscaler, you don't need a DR plan or have a secondary environment for your most business critical applications. And here's why that happens. It's not a falsehood being spread by the hyperscalers. The hyperscalers, somebody at one of the hyperscalers told me that about 82%-ish of their environment is in of their clients have their environment in a single availability zone, in the single region. And it's because clients here, they understand the architecture of these hyperscalers, which, like AWS, for example, has 3 data centers within a region. And your data is striped across the 3. It's not replicated, it's striped across the 3. So think of it like a RAID disk. They're treating the data centers similar to RAID. And if one of those 3 goes out, you're still up and running. Now, what's the odds of 3 data centers failing simultaneously? It's pretty low. But you know what can happen? The network of that environment can go down. The fabric of that environment can go down. And that's what we experienced for various reasons. We saw regions going down with these providers because of an issue that took down the entire region. And that brought down applications like Venmo. That's huge. Like, you can't pay for services for half a day. There were a lot of applications that went down. So I think it's a misconception because they heard this is similar to RAID, so they felt like it was a warm, fuzzy blanket. But that security blanket wasn't real. It only protected you from a very small sliver of the possibilities. So from the hyperscaler perspective, you do have to have a DR plan. You have to have your most business critical applications, depending on what their impact would be if they were down for 2, 4, 8, 12 hours. What would be that impact your business? You have to define the RPO and RTO of your applications, regardless of where they're housed, whether it's a hyperscaler, public cloud, private cloud, doesn't matter. On-prem for you. You have to identify the RPO and RTO, recovery points and recovery times, right? How recent does the data need to be? How quickly do you need it back up and running? You identify those, then you have to figure out your DR strategy. The platform no longer does not matter. It doesn't change things for you. Now, how you protect those changes, but you still have to know your RPO and RTO, and you have to have a plan in place to achieve them. From a backup perspective, with again, the security concerns, but also human error, the criticality of our data. Our businesses run on the data. We have to have backup. We have to have, as you mentioned, Chris, 3, 2, 1, 3 copies of our data. We have to have one of them offsite, immutable, right? You'll hear it 32110 as the extended form of the 321. One of them has to be offline. Funny enough, I've seen organizations revert back to tape for that offline copy, right? Tape's not dead. But there's immutability that you can set in object storage. So I would say the miss is that thinking that you have a warm, fuzzy blanket and realizing that it is not real. It's a facade. And it's simply a facade because of misconception, nothing more.
Yeah. And so out of that, let's talk about how like a private cloud provider helps handle some of those things. They're sharing in that workload just as much as they're sharing in the management of the server. I mean, I hear it all the time. backup alert fatigue is a big deal. And you talked about initially that really cool story that you had with that customer about plan and testing. Those are two of the big things I see from the IT side when it comes to the managing the backup and disaster recovery. Is really the alert fatigue on all of these backups. Are they being ran down when a backup fails? And then really it's that DR plan, testing it, but then even to go a step further on that, real world, do the exercises. Don't just boot the server up, see that you can log in and the services are running. We need to run real world tabletop exercises. What does this mean to get marketing involved with potentially the outage posts that they're going to make, the executive team level, who's all going to have a seat, not just when there's an outage, but if it's related to a security breach, things like that, as well. And so, with that, one of the closing questions that I have for you, Moosa, is, why should customers evaluate backups and DR as part of their cloud strategy? Because I think this is the swing and the miss. People look at the backups as an afterthought because they've went to the cloud and they said, well, we're probably okay. Like you said, that data's striped, so there's probably not going to be an issue. So we're moving the goalpost back. We're saying, why should we evaluate this as part of a cloud migration? And then maybe talk a little bit about how private cloud providers like 1111 Systems really makes that a seamless solution.
I would say one of the important things is your backup and DR is no longer a luxury. It's no longer an afterthought. Security is not an afterthought. And if you take a look at the NIST framework, backup and recovery, your disaster recovery plan is actually part of your security plan. It's part of the security framework. So the first thing I would ask customers is to stop thinking of backup and disaster recovery as a separate standalone item. It's part of your security posture. The next thing I would say is when you're looking at backups and DR as part of your migration plan, try to take a look at something that has it integrated. Still meets that 321, hopefully 32110. Some immutability, separate data center, something that is really protecting you, getting that data set offsite, not in the same cabinet or even data center as that production one. And most providers have that. Most providers have integrated some level of backup at the very least into their cloud, whether it's AWS, Azure, GCP, 1111, Expedient, TierPoint. There's the ability to integrate backups right into it. There's also the ability to replicate to a secondary site. AWS has something where if you have an on-prem workload and you want to have your DR environment, AWS and Azure both have it, by the way, and you want to have your DR infrastructure in their environment, they have their own tool sets that you can use for continuous replication. I think that one of the other mistakes, and it was on your last slide, is one of the must-dos. All of this is a living, breathing thing. Your DR plan is a living, breathing document. It is a plan that continues as your environment changes, as your organization changes, that document changes. And it becomes overwhelming. Everybody's trying to keep the lights on. So when you look at your cloud migration, really take a look at not just the ability to do it, but what does the day-to-day look like for you and your team? How are you going to simplify the testing of it? Because gone are the days where we're pulling in an entire team on a Saturday and a Sunday or a holiday weekend. Because most businesses now, 24/7. Right? So taking them down for a weekend like we used to do years ago, or saying, oh, it's 4th of July weekend, we need everybody to come in, we're going to do a test. We're going to fail over to the other environment and test it for 12 hours and then bring it back. You can't take down in most environments for that amount of time anymore. So take a look at the ability to run tests. What's the where's the delineation of responsibility? How easy is it going to be? Many of the public cloud providers, ourselves included, have through their management console the ability to run a test through a radio button, the ability to create application stacks and create a virtual recovery plan that could be automated. And being able to take a look at that and through a simplified GUI interface, update your run book regularly, being able to hit a radio button, generate a report, and make sure that things failed over. Because that failover, like you said, Chris, it's not about just having the server up and running on the other side and I can log in. You got to make sure the server's up and running, you can log in, the application is running, the data is mounted and valid, and your users can get to it. That's what it all comes down to. Our goal when we run a test isn't to get your environment up and running. It's to get to your users and employees back to productivity. And without all 5 of those components, they're not back to productivity. So I think that's the critical piece, and that's where it becomes overwhelming for an organization to take that level. So really ask, what does a DR strategy look like with this? Ask the provider that you're looking at. How do we incorporate DR? How are backups? What do we have to manage? How do we update the run book as we change something on the environment? Those are really critical questions to know up front. You don't want to have buyer's remorse.
Yeah, and I think it's also critical, you said ask the managing provider that's going to be hosting your data. A lot of those in organizations have the capability to also host and manage those backups for you at some level. So a lot of the same reasons that we see as to the shift from in-house management of some of these environments, whether it's alert fatigue, the after hours to spin up the test environments, things like that. We're seeing that on the backup side. And these organizations, much like they'll manage your infrastructure, will also manage your backups, and they can be mutually exclusive from each other. You can have it with one cloud provider and have another provider managing backups, or vice versa, or they can be singular solutions. But I think certainly the key to good backups in DR is, like you said, that run book. But also, as well, in addition to that run book, is the testing. How many times have we heard horror stories where we had backups in place, but oh, by the way, they didn't actually restore what we needed them to restore, or the data was missing, or the data was corrupt, or we didn't really do the math on this, and it would have taken 30 hours to get the environment back up. By the way, it takes 80 hours to do a recovery. Well, pick your poison on that one. So I think really that DR plan, and we see it a lot. People don't keep those DR plans up to date. I can't stress enough, build the DR plan, keep it up to date. Have other circumstances. I think what brought a light to cloud backups and backups in general has been, the years of ransomware, but other security events happen. So, we've seen a big pendulum shift to say, oh, our DR plan really only covers like, a ransomware event. Okay, but what about all the other failures that can occur? Network outage and, service outage, or as, a hyperscaler being down like we've seen this year with all of them. And so understanding how that looks is, I think, key. So, with that, Moosa, we're kind of getting to the end of time here, but maybe give us a quick commercial about 1111, what you guys do, who you are, the shameless plug, if you would. You've provided a lot of info that is not necessarily specific to you guys, but more about the industry, and really appreciate having you on as somebody to talk about cloud and backup and kind of the state of the industry and where we're going and some of the considerations our customers should be making. But tell me a little bit about 1111 Systems. Give us the commercial for us.
Yeah, great. I appreciate the time for that, Chris. The really 1111 system was born because of the desire to really streamline that experience. A lot of the things that we've been talking here have driven the architecture, the functionality that we have as an organization, the product development, and the services we provide. So when we talk about public cloud, for example, our IaaS infrastructure, we initially created an IaaS infrastructure, and we've been doing it for nearly 20 years, and it's a VMware hosted. It's the largest privately held VMware cloud environment in the world. And when you look at the management console, that's really the magic to it. It's a very simplified GUI interface to be able to manage everything from a single portal, but not just manage your resource allocation, take a look at your usage. You could take a look at your billing. But on top of that, the ability to do simplified or advanced backups. So we can have cohesivity advanced backups, application aware backups, and it's a simple button click. You choose your retention policies on there on an application basis. But then on top of that, you can also choose to replicate to another data center. You could test that replication, test that failover. You can create virtualized runbooks. So the magic behind all of that is simplifying that the magic behind it is simplifying the management into a single interface to make it easier for our clients to really do all of this advanced functionality and make sure it works, test it, fail over, generate reporting for their executive team so they can see that they are getting the return on the investments that they've chosen to make with us. But there's another component to that, right? You got to connect to all of this. So our founders heritage is really in the network side and working on building out high-speed networks throughout the U.S. So we've at the creation of 1111, we've also been able to provide connectivity globally for our clients and leveraging connectivity in different architectures in a very unique way to give high-speed access for organizations, whether they're small, medium, or large, giving them access globally and then giving them the visibility into that network, which is something that's a little bit different and it doesn't necessarily come with your standard providers like Lumen, AT&T, and Verizon. We do use those underlying networks, but we're providing clients with the visibility across, again, streamlined management interface, being able to take a look at their infrastructure, their network, the performance of their network. How many times have IT teams run into applications running slow? Let me figure out what it is. And now they got to take a look. Is it the application, the infrastructure that application is sitting on? Do I need more resources? Oh, wait, is it the LAN? Oh, no, wait, it's the WAN. It's the connection coming into it. Now let me open a ticket there. The ability to take a look through things in a single interface and be able to identify where the challenges are for latency, for application performance. That's a big goal of ours. And tying that all in with the security strategy, that's where we come in. And everything I just mentioned is very, very modular. We've had clients that have simply used us for a DR target to replicate. And when they do have to do a failover because of some event, unfortunately, they've seen the performance there, the simplicity of that failover. They've chosen to promote that then, and then we replicate that back. So now we become their public cloud provider. And as they start seeing things, they realize that it would be great to have network visibility. So they overlay our management onto those ports. And then on top of all of that, with the proliferation of data and how much backup we do, we have a very unique agreement with AWS to be able to leverage their S3 storage and provide it to our clients, but do so without any egress fees. So one of the big barriers to moving large sets of data to cloud is not necessarily the cost of going into the cloud, but the egress fees every time you read it or access it. So we flattened that out for S3, and we're the only provider globally that can actually say we flattened out and made a predictable pricing model for S3 storage in AWS. So just I would say when you think of 1111, yes, infrastructure, DR as a service, network, and object storage with security layered across. But what it really comes down to is an organization that was built to address the challenges of our IT partners with streamlining the management, providing a simplified, predictable model that they can rely on with reduced risk.
Yeah. And Moosa, I think of one other thing. I think of your pro services team, whether that be the team that's responsible for running tabletop exercises and really working through that vetting of a DR plan, whether that's the team that does manage DR, that builds that DR plan for you guys, whether that's the team that's assisting with, validating those workloads that need to be transferred to the cloud. You guys offer a plethora of different pro services at all the kind of different steps of the process, I think, as well. And you have a large bench of people that are very knowledgeable. And because of that background of both the storage and the network, you really, as an organization, grasp how it is to make sure that the infrastructure is set up correctly, that the users can access that infrastructure correctly, but then from the backup side of things, making sure that the resources are highly available and that everything is configured and running as it should be and that it's been tested and vetted.
Yeah, the professional services piece, the consulting piece, that's what it starts with quite often. Most organizations haven't built any sort of disaster recovery plan. They haven't gone through a business impact analysis. They haven't really defined their RPOs and RTOs for what the business needs today. So yes, absolutely, that is a piece that is heavily leaned on in order to define those things for clients that haven't been able to go through that exercise previously. And I think the differentiator between us and many other organizations is that consulting engagement. It's really at an accelerated timeline. We're able to execute on that rather quickly and get you to an understanding much quicker because we're not trying to just extend out a consulting engagement for the sake of dragging it out. We're looking to get you protected as quickly as possible because that's our core business. This is a service that we provide to clients to help them get to solving the problems they're trying to solve.
Awesome. Well, Moosa, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate having you on. I know we've talked about getting you on the podcast here for a little while and finally made it happen. Was happy to talk cloud with you and kind of talk through some of the pitfalls that you see customers when they either migrate or re-migrate to the cloud or any of those things. So thank you so much for your time today and appreciate everybody who took the time out of their day to watch today as well. So thank you so much, Moosa.
Thank you, Chris. Been so much fun, man.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great one.
You too.